You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Law and Disorder, where we dive into the world of true crime stories with memorable cases that have lasting effects for law enforcement.
The disappearance and murder of a child is gut-wrenching, both to the family of that child and the public at large, no matter the circumstances that lead to that tragic loss. Timing in a missing child case is crucial. According to a U.S. Department of Justice statistic, in the United States, roughly one child goes missing every 90 seconds. According to a 2019 statistic, about 9% of all child abductions are masterminded by a relative of that child, and the main motivation is a battle for the child's custody. On today's episode of Law and Disorder, we are covering the disappearance of Caylee Anthony and the trial of her mother, Caylee Anthony, while also discussing the legacy that this case left behind to protect future missing children from the dangers of delayed reporting to law enforcement. The investigation into Caylee Anthony's disappearance was a top story for local and national news outlets from the moment the 2-year-old was declared missing. The media circled in as law enforcement worked with the family to narrow down the child's last known whereabouts, and the public rallied in droves to participate in large-scale searches for the missing toddler. The case remains at the very front of public consciousness, so it's really important that we continue to talk about it today. So let's get started with our timeline of the case. So Caylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9th of 2005. Her mother, Caylee Anthony, was only 19 years old and a single parent. Caylee and her infant daughter lived outside of Orlando, Florida, with her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, and George and Cindy were very active in Caylee's upbringing. The Anthony home could be a rather tumultuous place, with the usual family drama and arguments, especially when you have 3 generations living under the same roof. But there's a true start to this case, and it begins on June 16th of 2008. On the day after Father's Day, an argument broke out among the Anthony family, and Caylee decided she'd had enough. She packed up Caylee, who was almost 3 years old, and the two would take off in the family's car. Over the next 31 days, Cindy and George Anthony tried to contact their daughter to reconcile, or at the very least to see their granddaughter Caylee, but Caylee always seemed to have some excuse as to why they couldn't meet up. She was too busy with a work assignment in Tampa, Florida. Caylee was with a nanny, or even that the mother and daughter were traveling to one of the nearby theme parks or the beach. But then on July 15th, George received a call that Caylee's car had been towed. This is the car that she used to flee the family home a month earlier. George went to the yard to recover it, and upon approaching the vehicle, both he and the attendant noticed a very strong odor emanating from it. The pair opened the trunk and found a bag of trash left inside, but the smell seemed to be far more foul than just a simple bag of trash would leave behind. Puzzled, and now more worried, George returns home with the car to discuss what to do with Cindy. It becomes imperative to the couple that they need to track down their daughter for an explanation, not only for her now 31 days of excuses and the disturbing state in which the car was discovered, but also to make sure that the absence of their granddaughter is not at all related to these events that have unfolded. Eventually, the couple do track Caylee down, and while at first she continues to sing her tune of excuses, giving various vague explanations as to why Caylee's not with her, she eventually admits to Cindy that Caylee is missing, and she has been busy looking for her while also being afraid to contact authorities. But Caylee has not been missing for a few hours. No, Caylee has been missing for nearly a month. Cindy immediately calls 911 and reports 3-year-old Caylee missing to the Orange County Sheriff's Office. During the call, she also mentions the state of the car that George recovered that morning and the odor coming from the trunk. She informs investigators of the shocking admission Caylee had just provided her about Caylee's month-long disappearance and pleads with authorities to have her arrested. Investigators immediately begin to construct a search effort for the missing toddler, and while Caylee is not immediately arrested, detectives do sit her down and question her about her daughter's whereabouts, looking to find any information about where she was last seen, anyone she could be with, or even the circumstances by which she went missing. Caylee sits down with investigators and describes that the last she saw her daughter was on July 9th at a nearby apartment complex with her nanny, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, who Casey would refer to throughout the case as Zanny, or Zanny the nanny. Casey asserts that the nanny had abducted Caylee that day while she was away at work at Universal Studios in Orlando, and she hadn't seen either of them since. The detectives feel that this is a solid lead, and if they can track down Zanny the nanny, chances are that even if they don't find Caylee with her, they can at least get some more information about where the child might be. But almost immediately, they start to find some inconsistencies with the young mother's story. Investigators have Casey take them to the apartment complex where Zanny supposedly lived, and nothing panned out. Eventually, it's learned that while Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez is a real person living in the area, and Casey had mentioned her in statements to the police, this woman had no idea who Casey was. She had never been seen by any of Casey's family or friends, and there was in fact no nanny. A similar situation arose when authorities brought Casey to an office at the Universal Studios campus in Orlando. As Casey led police through an office area, playing it off as if she worked there, and was leading them into her workplace, Casey admitted that while she had worked at Universal Studios before on a contract, she was not currently employed, and she was not an employee there on July 9th when Caylee supposedly went missing. In fact, when officers asked Casey to take them to her office, she led them around aimlessly for 25 minutes before she stopped, started smiling, and then jokingly admitted that she had been fired years before. Evidently, she had been lying to her parents about working at Universal Studios for years. The wild goose chase led to Casey's initial arrest on charges of child neglect, providing false statements to law enforcement, and obstruction of a criminal investigation on July 16th of 2008, only about 24 hours after Caylee was actually declared missing. A judge deemed that based upon Casey's, quote, woeful disregard for the welfare of her child, she would be denied bail. However, on July 22nd, Casey was subject to a bond hearing related to the charges against her, and while she was being held on relatively minor charges, once investigators entered evidence to the judge declaring Casey as a person of interest in the disappearance of her daughter, her bail was set to $500,000. Casey was offered a limited immunity deal by prosecutors on July 29th relating to the false statements given to law enforcement about locating her child, but Casey refused the deal. Casey remained incarcerated until August 20th, 2008, when her bail was posted by the nephew of California bail bondsman Leonard Padilla, who posted her bond hoping that the young mother would cooperate with investigators and lead them to Caylee. 10 days later, however, the bond was rescinded and Casey was carted back to the Orange County Jail. Eventually, her bail was posted by her parents, and she was granted a limited release on the condition that she be fitted for an electronic tracking device. Tips were also steadily coming into the sheriff's office even before Casey's bail was ever posted. From August 11th through the 13th, a local utility worker named Roy Kronk called the police and said he noticed a suspicious object in the wooded area near the Anthony family home. On August 11th, during his initial call, he was instructed to call the case's tip line, which he did, and he never received a return call. On his second attempt, he was eventually met by two police officers and reported that he saw what appeared to be a skull next to a gray bag. But when police officers searched the area, they came up with nothing. Search parties coordinated by the Orlando Sheriff's Office and Texas-based EquiSearch assembled through the summer, combing miles of Florida wilderness and swampland for any sign of Caylee. Over 2,000 volunteers from around the country assisted in the search effort, many of them moved by the emotionally jarring media coverage of the case on both local and national news outlets. The search went on for weeks and led nowhere, and the longer Caylee was missing, the more concerned the public became that she would never be found. And on October 14th, after months of collecting evidence and building their case to present to a grand jury, Caylee Anthony was indicted by a grand jury on the charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to police. She was soon rearrested on these new, far more severe charges, and Judge John Jordan ordered she be held without bond. And a big question that arises here is how could Caylee Anthony be charged with first-degree murder if Caylee's body had not been found? Wouldn't we want to hold on to that hope that Caylee might still be found alive? And this then leads to a broader question of how can someone be charged with murder if a body has not been found? Well, the answer has to do with how the prosecution builds and presents their case to the grand jury. When the prosecution is putting together their case, they're trying to compile evidence and construct a narrative that essentially describes how a specific crime took place. This evidence can be in the form of witness statements, physical evidence collected at a scene or from the execution of a search warrant, or even evidence from a victim's body during an autopsy, among many other sources depending on the exact case. But there are different types of evidence. So we have biological evidence like DNA, fingerprints, or hair, for example, that can physically connect someone to the scene. Think about it. We're carrying and shedding our biological material with us wherever we go, and only you can truly carry your own DNA around with you at all times. We could go through a rabbit hole of what ifs, but generally speaking, we are the only ones to carry enough of our individual DNA on a daily basis to leave any real biological evidence behind. There's also circumstantial evidence. Think of this as being at the right place at the right time. Circumstantial evidence can really be anything. It can be an eyewitness seeing someone suspicious leaving an apartment building and reporting it to the authorities. And as the authorities dig into it, it turns out that they saw the assailant leaving 5 minutes after a stabbing occurred. It could be a call from a cell phone that pings off of a tower near where a body is later found, and after looking at the medical examiner's report, it's found that the call was made around the victim's estimated time of death. As someone who regularly teaches high school students how evidence is assembled to make a case in court, I like to describe circumstantial evidence as essentially fleshing out the details of a scientifically definitive evidence in a case. Circumstantial evidence, while less scientifically definitive, can be crucial in closing really any case. When attempting to indict an individual for first-degree murder when a body has been discovered, the prosecutor has to argue, based upon the evidence that's collected in the case, both biological or scientifically measured evidence and circumstantial evidence, they have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the homicide was premeditated or planned. So when you have a body, you're looking for evidence of a struggle, biological evidence that definitively places both a victim and perpetrator to the scene, and circumstantial evidence, like witness statements that corroborate a history of tension between a victim and a suspect. As a prosecutor, you would have a fairly solid case with all of this. But what if there's no body? Cases like this are historically difficult to prove, but it is possible to charge someone with homicide in the absence of a body. Essentially, if enough circumstantial evidence can be presented that proves that the victim in the case is more than likely deceased, and that if they are deceased, the homicide was premeditated, you can still theoretically present it to a jury. In the case of Caylee Anthony's indictment for the charge of first-degree murder against her daughter Caylee, this was very much the case. Caylee's body was yet to be found in October of 2008, but prosecutors felt that they had more than enough evidence to prove, firstly, that Caylee Anthony had murdered her daughter Caylee, and secondly, that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the murder had been premeditated. So, what kind of evidence did they present to make the case to the grand jury? Remember the odor that was emanating from the car when George Anthony collected it from the tow yard? He described the scent as if there had been a dead body in the trunk. Investigators dispatched cadaver dogs to the Anthony home to further investigate the odor in the car, and the dog did signal a positive identification of human decomposition in the vehicle. Cadaver dogs also combed through the Anthony property and signaled the presence of an odor of human decomposition in the Anthony's backyard. Additional evidence was also collected from the car that alerted investigators to the possible fate of the child. Hairs were found in the trunk of the vehicle that matched hairs that were taken from Caylee's hairbrush, and when examined microscopically, the hair samples from the car exhibited a phenomenon called root banding, which is where the hair follicle exhibits a dark band after death, and that's consistent with hair shed from a dead body. The air from the car's trunk was also chemically tested and showed the presence of chemical compounds that were consistent with human decomposition and the presence of chloroform. All of this evidence gave the prosecution a sure enough case to secure an indictment from the grand jury, and Caylee Anthony was subsequently charged and rearrested. A week after the indictment, the charges of child neglect were dropped, as the state attorney's office stated, As the evidence proved that the child was deceased, the state sought an indictment on the legally appropriate charges, which essentially says that based upon the evidence in the case, the first-degree murder charge is a more appropriate classification of the actions that created the case in the first place. And in this case, the charge of child neglect would just kind of be an egregious addition. In her arraignment on October 28th, Caylee pled not guilty to all of the charges against her, and her defense team began to prepare for trial. About 6 weeks after Caylee is charged with first-degree murder, there is a tragic break in the case. Remember utility worker Roy Kronk, who attempted to alert police to the presence of a suspicious object near the Anthony home in August? Well, despite the months that had passed, this man still felt that there was something suspicious in that wooded area near the Anthony family home. When he went to do his own search, he came upon an abandoned laundry bag, and inside of the bag, wrapped in a blanket, appeared to be the skeletal remains of a small child. Police were called, and the remains were transported to the medical examiner's office to undergo autopsy. On December 20th, 2008, the discovered remains are confirmed to belong to Caylee Anthony. Due to the state of the remains at the time of discovery, the medical examiner was unable to determine the toddler's exact cause and date of death. However, from the examination of the remains, the Orange County Chief Medical Examiner concluded that the bones showed no evidence of trauma and that the toddler's death would be classified as homicide by undetermined means, despite the fact that there was a piece of duct tape found on the victim's skull that appeared to be covering the nose and mouth. With a lack of tissue to examine, there was really no way to confirm that the placement of the tape led to the child's death. And the weight of the discovery of Caylee's body hits both the family and the public very heavily. After months of no answers, there's finally an answer, and it's the worst possible one. A very young child has died, and prosecutors believe it was at her mother's hand. The public is particularly appalled by the tragedy of the case, and their outrage is fueled by the continuing media frenzy, especially as Caylee assembles her defense team and both sides of the aisle prepare for trial. Protesters assemble regularly in front of the Anthony family home, shouting defamatory statements at the family, and on at least one instance, physically assaulting Caylee's father, George Anthony. On October 13th of 2009, the prosecution announces that they will seek the death penalty in the case against Caylee Anthony, and the tensions are extra high. The lead prosecutor in the case is Assistant State Attorney Linda Drain Burdick, who worked with fellow Assistant State Attorneys Frank George and Jeff Ashton to create the state's case against Caylee Anthony. Caylee's defense team is led by Florida criminal defense attorney Jose Baez, with attorneys J. Cheney Mason, Dorothy Clay Sims, and Ann Finnell serving as co-counsel. While the prosecution was assembling their timeline of events, the defense was simultaneously assembling a case that would come to shock members of the jury and the general public. The highly anticipated trial would be televised, after all. On May 24th of 2011, the state of Florida versus Caylee Marie Anthony begins under the provision of Judge Belvin Perry at the Orange County Courthouse in Orlando, Florida. The jury in the case was chosen from the nearby Pinellas County, as attorneys on both sides worried that the case had been so widely publicized in Orlando that the jury pool would be contaminated with too many preconceived notions about the young mother and her guilt in the case. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the jury was sequestered this entire time, knowing that the local and national news coverage of the case was so widespread that the court aimed to keep the jury from being influenced by any information in the case outside of the courtroom. The prosecution begins with its opening statement. Their case seems fairly straightforward, and lead prosecutor Linda Drain Burdick takes time to outline the story of Caylee Anthony's disappearance day by day. She asserts that the murder of Caylee was intentional and premeditated, and reminded the jury that the state was seeking the death penalty in the case. The prosecution's description of how the state believed Caylee Anthony's death occurred was jarring, and the state believes that Caylee Anthony used chloroform to render Caylee unconscious and then placed duct tape over her nose and her mouth to cause suffocation before leaving Caylee in the back of the car for a few days and then disposing of her remains. According to the prosecution, Caylee Anthony killed her daughter to free herself from the shackles of parenthood and return to her wild social life. The defense's opening statement, and ultimately their case, is completely different. Attorney Jose Baez presents the jury with the defense's version of events. They assert that on June 16, 2008, Caylee Anthony accidentally drowned in the family pool, and she was found by her grandfather, George Anthony, who scolded Casey for her irresponsibility and told her that she would go to jail for the rest of her life for child neglect if anyone found out what happened to Caylee. So he proceeded to cover up young Caylee's death. The defense further argued that this was the reason why Casey went on with her life, quote, as usual, and failed to report her daughter missing for 31 days. The defense painted Casey as a victim of circumstance. She had been conditioned throughout her lifetime to hide her pain and pretend nothing was wrong, and that this behavior supposedly stemmed from a past of sexual abuse at the hands of her father from the age of 8, as well as a history of sexual advances from her brother Lee. But the allegations of sexual assault were not the end of the case that the defense was about to present. Baez also asks the jury to consider the individual who discovered Caylee's remains in the wooded area near the Anthony home, Roy Kronk. Had he moved the remains from another location? And had the police truly been thorough and honest in their findings in their investigation? In Baez's mind, for a police department seeming to benefit from a media frenzy, an actual drowning is a bit less newsworthy than a mother murdering her child in cold blood. But the defense did conclude their opening statement by admitting that Casey did, in fact, lie about Zanny the nanny in the initial days of the case. The public was a bit shocked by the two very different cases that were being laid out during the trial, and the sensationalism of the proceedings is very quickly compared to the last quote-unquote trial of the century, the People versus OJ Simpson. This case would live up to its predecessor with equally as shocking witness testimony throughout the trial, and even in the verdict, which we'll get to in a little bit. But witnesses began to take the stand for both sides of the case, and Casey's parents are among the first to testify. George Anthony is the first on the stand, and he immediately and adamantly denies the allegations of sexual abuse that the defense asserted during opening statements. And he says he never knew about Caylee's drowning. He's then asked about the smell that came from the trunk of the car. George mentions that in the time between when Casey left the family home with Caylee on June 16th and when Caylee is ultimately reported missing on July 15th, he did see Casey one time on June 24th, and she had the car with her. He mentioned that the smell that was present in the car when he collected it from the tow yard on July 15th was not present in the car when he saw Casey on June 24th. When Cindy Anthony takes the stand, she is asked about the 911 call where she said to the dispatcher that Casey's car smelled like someone died, and she assured them that that was just a figure of speech. Jose Baez called a forensic expert from the FBI onto the stand to analyze the results of a paternity test that the FBI had done to determine whether Casey's brother Lee was actually Caylee Anthony's father. The test results came back negative. One of Casey's ex-boyfriends, a man named Ricardo Morales, was called onto the stand and asked about a photo he'd posted to his MySpace page that depicted a poster with the words, "Win her over with chloroform," written on it. He asserts that he had never actually discussed chloroform with Caylee Anthony or searched for chloroform on a computer, and the photo was just a MySpace post. But an additional witness, a former Canadian law enforcement officer turned software engineer named John Dennis Bradley, said as part of the investigation, he was able to use a program to recover deleted searches from the Anthony family computer that had been made between March 17th and March 21st of 2008. In that time, someone had searched the website scispot.com for chloroform 84 times. Bradley expressed his belief that some of the items that were searched for may have been bookmarked, but when he was cross-examined by the defense, Bradley agreed there were 2 individual accounts on the desktop and there was no way to know who actually performed these searches. But later in the trial, he actually admits to an error that occurred in the software and determines that the user of the computer only searched for chloroform once, and the website in question had referred to uses of chloroform in the 19th century. But chloroform remains a fairly common topic on the stand for a while. On June 6th, a forensics expert named Armand Voss from Oak Ridge National Laboratory takes the stand and testifies about the levels of chloroform found in the trunk of Casey's car. He asserts that the levels of chloroform were shockingly high, and we typically think of chloroform as a drug used to render someone unconscious, which it can, but it's also a naturally occurring chemical that is released during decomposition. From the concentration of the chloroform found in the trunk, it was apparent to this expert that a dead body would have had to be in the trunk for such a high level of the compound to be present. However, the next day, the testimony of an FBI analyst who took the stand would slightly contradict his statement after he compared the chloroform level in the trunk to amounts that could be found in everyday household cleaners. But in addition to the chloroform testimony, there's additional testimony about other searches performed on the Anthony family's computer, especially in March of 2008, during the hours that George and Cindy were normally at work. Topics of these searches included terms like head injuries, ruptured spleen, chest trauma, and internal bleeding. And eventually, Caylee Anthony would take the stand again and admit that she had been the one to search chloroform on the family's computer in March of 2008. The controversy of the evidence from the family's search history would remain a point of contention throughout the case. But additionally, evidence from the medical examiner's office and the reports from both Caylee's initial autopsy performed by Orange County Chief Medical Examiner Jan Garaviglia and a second autopsy by forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz were presented in court. The defense called Dr. Spitz to the stand to challenge Dr. Garaviglia's autopsy report, and he stated that he was not comfortable ruling the child's death a homicide after performing that secondary autopsy. This was simply because, from the appearance of the remains, he believed there was no indication to him that she was murdered. He had also heavily discussed the presence of the duct tape on the skull and asserted his belief that the tape had been placed there after decomposition had already taken place. And this duct tape was a very large part of witness testimony as well. The chief investigator for the medical examiner stated that the original placement of the duct tape was unclear, and it could have shifted positions as he collected the remains. And when Caylee Anthony took the stand, she did admit that when the family needed to bury deceased pets in the past, they were wrapped in a blanket that was then sealed with duct tape. But then, FBI latent print examiner Elizabeth Fontaine was called to the stand. She testified that adhesive in the shape of a heart was found in the corner of one of the pieces of duct tape that was covering the mouth portion of Caylee's remains during ultraviolet testing, and she also mentioned that she found no fingerprints of any of the 3 pieces of duct tape from the case that she analyzed. However, this wasn't shocking to her, as she believed that in the time that had passed between the victim's death and the discovery of the remains, any fingerprints that had been on the tape would have deteriorated to the point beyond detection. But she did also mention that when she went to show the findings from the outline of the sticker on the duct tape to her supervisor, she did not initially try to photograph the heart-shaped adhesive, and explained, "When I observe something as unexpected, I note it and I continue with my examination." During the defense's cross-examination, Fontaine explained that when she examined the sticker evidence a second time, after subjecting the tape to dye testing, it was no longer visible. But while the medical examiner never found any evidence of sticker residue on Caylee's remains or anywhere near where the remains were found, the story of the sticker outline and the residue really tugged at the heartstrings of the public. This showed that Caylee was a toddler covered in stickers when an absolutely aberrant act was committed upon her. It seemed to be a striking reminder of this innocent child that had been lost with Caylee's tragic death. A few different witnesses were called to the stand to discuss the search that had taken place for Caylee's remains, and also to figure out why it took until December to find the remains, when the area where the remains were found had been searched multiple times in the summer and fall. 2 private investigators who had searched the area in November of 2008, and a representative from Texas-based EquiSearch who had participated in a videotaped search of the area around the same time, were cross-examined and asked how the body could have been found in that area in December when searches the month before came up empty-handed. Finally, the man who discovered Casey's remains, Roy Kronk, took the stand and recounted essentially the same story that he told police about his discovery of Caylee's remains back in December of 2008. He acknowledged that he received a $5,000 reward after the remains were identified to belong to Caylee Anthony, but he denied any claims that he told his son finding the body would make him rich and famous. The next day, his son was called to the stand and testified that his father had, in fact, made those exact statements to him. But another search and rescue volunteer was also called to the stand by the defense. She was a woman named Crystal Holloway, who had been a volunteer in the search for Caylee. She stated that she had had an affair with George Anthony during the rescue efforts, and testified that he had been to her home and he had texted her, quote, "Just thinking about you, I need you in my life," during that time. She told the defense that George Anthony had told her that Caylee's death was, quote, "an accident that snowballed out of control." Under cross-examination by prosecutors about her sworn statement to police, she admitted that she had claimed George Anthony believed Caylee's death was an accident, rather than actually knowing that it was an accident. And in her initial report, Holloway also recalled George Anthony saying, quote, "I really believe that it was an accident that just went wrong, and Casey tried to cover it up." She said that he had not told her that he was present when the alleged incident occurred, but he had given her the impression that he did know Caylee was deceased before her remains were actually found. For the defense, Crystal Holloway's testimony seemed like the final nail in the coffin for their case to defame the image of George Anthony, Casey's father. But then George Anthony took the stand an additional time to deny allegations of the affair and explain the visit to Holloway's home in text messages. Ultimately, Judge Perry did tell jurors that during their deliberations, they could use Holloway's testimony as means to impeach George Anthony's credibility, but that it was not proof of how Caylee died, nor was it evidence of Casey Anthony's guilt or innocence in this case. As witness testimony wraps up, everyone is feeling a bit jaded. Both cases seem to be opposite extremes that result in the same tragic outcome. And the public outside of the courtroom, wrapped tightly in this 24-hour news cycle and daily coverage of the case, are calling for a mother to find herself on death row for the incredibly heartbreaking death of her 2-year-old daughter. But closing arguments begin, and the prosecution makes one final, gut-wrenching plea to the jury, summarizing how nearly 400 pieces of evidence in the case fit together and point to the guilt of a young mother willing to do anything to return to her life of debauchery and irresponsibility. They remind the jury of the presence of the Winnie the Pooh blanket with Caylee's remains that matched the bedding in her grandparents' home. And they further criticize the defense's theory that Caylee drowned in the Anthony family pool and that Casey and George panicked upon finding the child's body and covered up her death. They advise jurors to use their common sense when deciding the verdict, concluding, "No one makes an accident look like a murder." They plead with the jury to consider a guilty verdict and a death penalty for the defendant. Before leading into their closing statement, Judge Perry warned the defense that while they could claim that Caylee's death was attributed to drowning due to reasonable conclusions that were corroborated by witness testimony, they were not allowed to continue their arguments about sexual abuse, since there was nothing presented in the evidence to support the claim that George sexually abused Casey. After 6 weeks of trial, the jury goes off into their deliberations. And on July 5th of 2011, the jury found Casey Anthony not guilty of counts 1 through 3 regarding first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and aggravated child abuse. However, they did find her guilty on counts 4 through 7, which included the providing of false information to law enforcement, and these were the claims that she made that were considered false. Anthony's initial claim that she was employed at Universal Studios during 2008, which led officers to pursue the investigation of the missing persons report. Casey's assertion that she had left Caylee at an apartment complex with a babysitter, which caused law enforcement to search for the missing babysitter. Casey's claim that she had informed two quote-unquote employees of Universal Studios, Jeff Hopkins and Juliette Lewis at Universal, about the disappearance of Caylee. And then finally, Casey's claim that she had received a phone call and spoken to Caylee on July 15th of 2008, which caused law enforcement to expend further resources in the search for the missing toddler. In sentencing, the defense asked for Casey's sentence to be based on one count of lying, on the grounds that the offenses occurred as part of a single interview with police that dealt with the same matter, the disappearance of her daughter. So technically, it could only be considered one continuous lie. The The defense also argued for concurrent sentences on all 4 counts, but the judge strongly disagreed with the defense's arguments, declaring that Anthony's statements consisted of 4 distinct, separate lies, and ordered that the sentences for each charge would be served consecutively, noting that law enforcement expended a great deal of time, energy, and manpower looking for Caylee Marie Anthony. Judge Perry sentenced Casey to 1 year in the county jail and $1,000 in fines for each of the 4 counts of providing false information to a law enforcement officer, which is the maximum penalty prescribed by law. She received 1,043 days credit for time served, plus additional credit for good behavior, which resulted in her release on July 17th of 2011. That September, Judge Perry also complied with a Florida statute that requires judges to assess investigative and prosecution costs if a state agency requests that they do so. Because of this statute, it was ruled that Caylee Anthony owed $217,000 to the state of Florida for costs directly related to lying to law enforcement about the death of Caylee, which included the costs of searches for Caylee through September 30th of 2008. That date was chosen because it was officially when the sheriff's office stopped investigating a missing child's case, right before the charges in the case were raised to first-degree murder. So much like the shocking not guilty verdict in the trial of OJ Simpson back in 1995, the public found themselves shocked. The case remained, and essentially remains, a very large part of our collective consciousness. The disappearance of Caylee Anthony and the sensationalized trial of her mother for her murder left the public shaken and disturbed. Many of the key players in the case remain under public scrutiny. A recent documentary premiered on Peacock and received polarizing reviews and great amounts of criticism for allowing Caylee Anthony a platform to try and tell her side of the story over 10 years after the verdict was announced. Despite her short life, Caylee's legacy lives on in the creation of various movements to create a new law, appropriately called Caylee's Law, which would impose stricter requirements on parents to notify law enforcement of the death or disappearance of a child. Of many various petitions, one such petition, circulated via change.org, has gained over 1.3 million electronic signatures, and these petitions are working. Laws have already been passed in Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Kansas that make it a felony for a parent or legal guardian to fail to report a missing child in cases where the parent knew or should have known that the child was in danger. These laws, and laws that are yet to be passed in many other states, are going to help ensure that fewer children find the same fate as Caylee Anthony. We thank you for tuning into this installment of Law and Disorder, and we hope that you'll join us next month as we cover yet another key case from American law enforcement history. As always, you can find more episodes of Law and Disorder and other Precinct 444 shows wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much to Christopher Mitchell for producing today's episode, and we hope to see you again soon at the Precinct.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.